Welcome to Pullback. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with Kyla Hewson.
Hello.
Trying to be a good person can be overwhelming in our complex global marketplace. In this podcast, we try to make it a little easier by looking at the details behind consumer movements, product labels, and ethical lifestyles. Each episode, we challenge ourselves to try something new in ethical consumption, and then we tell you what we learned, fuck-ups and all. This episode, we're talking about veganism because it is Veganuary.
Ooh, happy Veganuary. Oh, and Happy New Year. I guess we didn't say that in the vegetarianism episode because we actually recorded that like 1,000 years ago.
Yeah. Happy New Year. I hope people are still sticking to their New Year's resolutions or their corporate mission statements, as the case may be. But yeah, so Kyla, you've, both of us have been going vegan for the last 2 weeks. And how do you feel?
Oh, okay, we're gonna go right into it. You're just gonna call me out right away.
Oh no, we can do the challenges later. I just wanted to do like a quick check-in before we talk about veganism.
Let's do it. So I knew I was gonna be doing Veganuary. So in December, I did this really fun activity where I wrote down every time I ate meat for a month.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, because I was like, okay, I want to know what I'm missing when I go into Veganuary. So I ate meat.
Okay, that now sounds depressing.
No. Oh no, not like that. I wanted to see how hard, because I was like, oh, Veganuary won't be too hard. And I was like, well, maybe it will be if I eat meat every day and I just don't think about it. Like,
oh, I thought you were like cataloging the individual items. Like, oh, I had a steak on this day.
I mean, I did catalog the individual items. So I'll tell you right now, in December, I ate meat on 12 days. But I feel like a couple of them shouldn't count because on one day I had half of a piece of bacon because everyone around me was eating like this giant plate of bacon and it had smelled like bacon in the apartment for like a couple hours. And so I had half of one piece. So I failed that day. Not that I was doing anything in December special, but I did have to write that down. So 3 of the days I only ate fish, which I feel pretty good about. I don't feel that bad about eating fish. We haven't done a fish episode yet. One of the days was accidental because I ordered an egg McMuffin from McDonald's, forgetting that it comes with ham. I thought it was just going to be egg and cheese. That was my bad. And then on 6 of the days, it was cheeseburgers. So my problem seems to be cheeseburgers mostly, if I was being honest. Sure. We can go into Veganuary a little bit later, but how are you finding it so far?
So a lot easier than last time I did a short like veganism challenge. That was really hard last time. Mostly because at the time, I didn't really drink any alternative milks. And so when your first introduction to like soy milk and almond milk is in coffee that you've not necessarily like matched the flavors to, and you're used to like putting cream, which like was what I was used to and I really liked at the time, it was like a legitimate psychological barrier for me. But that was a couple years ago, and now that's not a challenge at all because I've been basically drinking alternative milks instead of dairy for a while. So yeah.
Just have black coffee. Buy coffee that's so nice that you don't need to dress it up.
I know, yeah. Well, I don't. I'm a coffee wuss, so I like my blonde roasts, and I like it with some soy milk. We'll maybe talk about the challenge in more detail after we've gone through veganism, but I suppose it was kind of interesting prepping the research for this episode because a lot of the same justifications that you would use for vegetarianism, they just apply to veganism, and you just kind of make the argument a little bit more consistent.
So then you're having trouble basically making this different from the vegetarianism episode? You're like, what do we talk about to make it stand out?
Well, at first I thought that, but then as I started to look into like the history of the veganism movement, there are actually a lot of complicated elements of it that like they don't so much have to do with the justification. The justification is mostly a combination of like animal rights, a little bit of environmental stuff, although that tends to be less important to vegans. Vegans tend to emphasize animal rights more. And then some people do it for health reasons too, but that's not really an ethical thing. But then if you look at like where veganism and vegan activists have gone over time, there's a lot of like sort of complicated intersections with other movements that have been problematic.
Yeah, you texted me something about Nazis.
Yeah, so we will talk a little bit about that. And I want to emphasize that I don't think that's like a diss on veganism. Like, I think you can be You can be a vegan just because you think factory farms are horrific, and that's a totally fair position to take. But there are animal rights activists that haven't been the most woke, let's say, and in some cases have been literal Nazis. So it's not great.
Let's get into it. Tell me about veganism.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, veganism is, although I think a lot of vegans would say that their history is really tied to vegetarianism, and so it is a much older movement. The term veganism actually wasn't coined until 1944, so it is pretty recent. And it was basically, there's this British guy named Donald Watson who died about 15 years ago. And he essentially said, people in the vegetarian movement that don't eat dairy and don't eat eggs need like a separate term to describe themselves. So we need to be able to come up with that. And he brought a bunch of his vegetarian friends together to try to come up with what the new term would be. So that's essentially how the Vegan Society came to be founded. So we've got about like a 60, 70-year history of veganism. Essentially, veganism is, as it's sort of self-described, it's a philosophy and a way of living that seeks to exclude all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. And by extension, it promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives. So those are the two sort of components of what it means to be a vegan. And as we mentioned in the vegetarianism episode, it is more of a way of life. So in this episode, we decided that we were going to focus on vegan diets. So we're not going to focus on animal products that are in makeup or animal products that are in clothing. Yeah, so it's just that would be way too much to talk about. We'll do other episodes on that. So just to say, though, that for vegans, in a lot of cases, not wearing leather is equally important to not eating cheese. We're not focusing on that in this episode, but that is a really important part to acknowledge. So I'll also say vegetarianism is like kind of mainstream now, and veganism is still a little bit more on the fringe. So it's a lot harder to do, not because in like theory, it's hard to feed yourself without eggs or dairy. That's actually pretty easy, but just because our society is set up around foods that have dairy and eggs and other animal derivatives just sort of in them.
There's hidden meat in everything, as we mentioned in our vegetarian episode.
Yeah, it's so fucked. Why do salt and vinegar chips have secret animal products in it? Why?
I was going to talk about this in the challenge part of the episode, but I went, because we're doing Veganuary, I went to buy like some Campbell's soup. I was like, oh, I'll get some vegetable soup. I'll just stock my cupboard so that if I get hungry, I need a snack, I'll have like a little thing of soup. All of the vegetable soups were using beef broth or egg whites. And I was like, why? Why?
Why you gotta be like that? But yeah, whereas vegetarianism is mainstream enough that like you pretty much always have an option on a restaurant menu, like especially if you're like in a city, and usually, it's like relatively easy to get products that don't have like gelatin in it or whatever. But for vegans, that pendulum's starting to move, but it still is a lot harder just because we have like secret meat and everything. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Veganuary as well, just to emphasize how new this is, right? Veganuary was actually only started in 2014. It's an incredibly new initiative. So it was started by a British charity, and since then it's really grown. So for our like typical Canadian listener, you may not have heard of Veganuary before because it's not as popular here. But in the UK, it's really big. In 2019, the charity Veganuary had 250,000 people that pledged to go vegan for January.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And that makes total sense because I had never heard of Veganuary until like 2 years ago, which is when I was living in London. So that makes sense. I didn't know that. I was like, oh, it is really new because I've only just heard of it, but also it's just like not as big here. So let's make it a thing.
Yeah. It's like, it's only really been around for 5 years, and probably when they were first founded, like I would imagine that there wasn't a 2014 Veganuary. Probably the first one was 2015 if they were founded in 2014. Really, in like a short period of time, they've gone from zero, like absolutely the initiative doesn't exist, to now they've got
250,000 people.
Yeah, and I mean, it's probably even bigger this year because they've been growing every year. So Veganuary is likely to just continue going gangbusters, I think.
I love it. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, and so in addition to like getting individuals to pledge to go vegan for January, and sometimes people try to do it for longer, Veganuary also draws participation from companies. So it's a way of mainstreaming the vegan movement more broadly, and like getting organizations and companies to launch plant-based parts of their menu or to launch plant-based products. So I think that's really cool as well. Veganuary is also supported by some mainstream celebrities. The only one that they have listed on their website that I actually had heard of before was Joaquin Phoenix, but I do not know pop culture, so...
Maybe I'll have a look at their website.
Yeah. But Joaquin Phoenix, actually, he was one of the forces behind lobbying for the all-vegan menu at the Golden Globes this year, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that was awesome. I saw that. And people were like tweeting like jokes about it. And I was like, were you there? No, chill.
Yeah, but I think it's pretty cool. So the people behind Veganuary are in some way connected to getting the Golden Globes to be vegan. And that's all part of making it easier for people that don't want to consume animal products to just be in the world, because it is relatively difficult. So why veganism then? We talked a little bit about how the justifications aren't so different from vegetarianism. And I also want to say that there's a wide spectrum of vegans, and they all have slightly different justifications for their lifestyle choice. But the sort of unifying thread is that almost all of them will view animal welfare as one of the main reasons. I think that's like a difference with vegetarianism, that even though there are environmental vegans and environmental vegetarians, there are more vegetarians that say their primary reason is the environment, which kind of makes sense because it allows you to be a little bit more inconsistent on the fact that dairy farming is also really bad for cows,
Yeah, and eggs production is like really not great either, unless you literally know the chicken you're getting the eggs from.
It's true, yeah. And so from an animal welfare perspective, vegans essentially argue that vegetarianism doesn't cut it for that reason, basically.
Well, and I don't know if I left this in the vegetarianism episode or if it hit the editing room floor, but cheese is like made with enzymes from the gut of animals. So a lot of animals are often killed in the cheese industry. I think I did leave this in, and also I was going to share it because it's really hard to describe. But basically, if you're eating cheese, it's not even really vegetarian even in some cases because animals were killed in the making of it. And I didn't know that until very recently, and it was very upsetting for me.
Well, and that's even the case for like if you're consuming eggs or dairy, like the cow that's milked gets killed eventually, and the chickens that are breeding, they also get killed, right? They're called spent chickens. It is kind of messed up, right? So
How old do they usually get? Do you know?
Yeah, I don't, but I'm sure I could find
Let's not look that up.
Yeah.
no, I don't want to know.
Yeah, they don't live a full life, and just the way that breeding on factory farms is done now, like the typical lifespan for a cow or a chicken is historically a lot longer than the factory farmed ones that we have now.
Sure, okay.
Yeah, they're not healthy. They're not happy. So the strongest version of a vegan argument essentially says that we shouldn't use animals as an end at all. So some vegans are actually would view it as wrong to even shear a very happy sheep for wool. And that's like the strongest version of the argument that you can have. But for most vegans, there's a focus on the very real contemporary horrors of our modern food, clothing, and cosmetics industries. And we focused a bit on that in the vegetarianism episode, so I don't want to duplicate it here. But I did find I don't know if you've have you heard of the book Sapiens or Homo Deus?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so there are two like best-selling, one was sort of like a look at the history of humanity, and one sort of a look forward to what humanity might be in like 1,000 years. And they're both written by a famous historian named Yuval Noah Harari. And he actually called animal farming the worst crime in history. So I think there's something to be said for the sort of scale of atrocities that are going on in factory farming. And so a lot of vegans, they're not focused on a happy sheep being sheared for wool. They're focused on, the cows and rape machines, Like there's
yeah, okay. Yeah. Like maybe the really hardcore ones are like, oh, I won't have a happy like sheep sheared, but also I care a lot more about all of the other nonsense. Yeah, okay. I can get on board with that.
Yeah, I just think it's important to point that out because vegans get caricatured a lot, Most of them are like pretty reasonable people that are just reacting to a horrific situation.
Well, I mean, the far end of any movement is going to be a little bit unhinged, no matter what they're advocating for, from what I can tell.
Yes.
You're going to get people making you look bad no matter how noble the cause.
The other thing that vegans will oftentimes point out is they'll take aim at the idea that humane meat is actually possible, right? So in the vegetarianism episode, a lot of the times we were talking about how you can choose humane certified alternatives. But for vegans, they'll often say, look, if you actually pull back the curtain on what those farms are like, in most cases, they're not all that humane. Like cage-free eggs are really not all that much better for birds and can actually be worse. But even if you could have like wild game or truly humane farms, it would be impossible to build that out on a scale that could feed everybody at the current rate of meat consumption. That would be an ecological...
So we might as well just be vegan.
Yeah, so like really the argument is that you can't have animal farming be workable at all, at least on the scale of meat consumption that we currently have. So they say really like the rest of it is like they're all fig leaves. What you really need to do is eat animal free as much as possible.
I think I mentioned in the cruelty-free episode that they have been growing like skin in petri dishes that they can like test cosmetics on, which is pretty bonkers. But also, I've read a lot about lab-grown meat in the last couple of years. I don't know where they're at right now, but that would probably be the only ethical way to really have meat, is like no animal was really harmed in the process. I mean, obviously hardcore vegans are going to be like, well, they had to take skin tissue from someone, but one cow having some skin tissue taken could feed like hundreds and hundreds of people, as opposed to hundreds and hundreds of cows feeding a few people.
Yeah, and we can talk about cultured meat a little later. But yeah, it's that and like plant-based products that are meant to really mimic the flavor profile of meat are sort of two areas where you're starting to see a lot of growth. But first, let's talk about veganism and whiteness, because it is an important topic to cover. So the vegan movement has run into some issues when it comes to race and inclusivity. I don't think that this is something that it's not like inherent to the beliefs of all vegans, but it has been a real problem for vegan activists in the past and in the present. So one of the main ways in which that's been true is attacks on Indigenous hunting. So I just want to first set out the justification why sort of when Indigenous people are sort of pushing back against the critiques that they've received from vegans. I want to just explain what that rationale is. For Indigenous people, hunting is sort of viewed as a traditional way of life, and especially given the trauma that has been inflicted upon them continually since colonization and into the present, there's a view that the ability to connect to those traditions is a really important part of cultural healing and resilience. It's also being able to hunt is an important element of food sovereignty, because these are often very food-deprived communities. So Indigenous people will point out that environmental stewardship and respect for the land and animals is embedded into their cultural traditions, that there's an ethic of not wasting and of really respecting an animal that's been killed. So from their perspective, hunting is a morally justifiable part of their way of life, and also sort of a crucial element of how they get by.
Survive, yeah.
Yeah, and so vegan activists have often come into conflict with this because they've criticized Indigenous hunting in various ways. And one of the sort of big hotspots of this was in 2017. There's a new Indigenous-owned and operated restaurant that opened in Toronto, and it had seal in 2 items on the menu. There was a huge backlash. Like, the vegan community targeted this restaurant in like a really strong way, which is kind of hypocritical because there's meat on like a whole bunch of restaurants' menus, and also like this indigenous restaurant had made a point specifically of vetting hunters for whom they sourced the seal meat. So they were actually doing a lot better than
literally any other
average
restaurant.
Toronto restaurant. Yeah. So like you can check out the documentary Angry Innu if you are interested in learning more about this issue. But just to say that like there has been a history of vegans targeting the seal hunt and indigenous hunting more broadly that has led to a lot of distrust between the indigenous between different indigenous communities and vegans,
which is so frustrating because they're really on the same page about most things. And it's like, guys, if you're going to attack anybody,
like target Tyson Foods. Don't target like the like indigenous individuals that are hunting sustainably within their traditional lands and like fighting for environmental stewardship. Those are your natural allies.
Yeah, and their whole way of life will come crumbling down if they have to stop. Exactly. Yeah. No, I agree. I am on the same page as you on that one.
Yeah. So, and it's not just anti-indigenous issues. So vegan activism has also been criticized for racism against other communities. So in 2003, PETA, the animal rights organization, released an ad that related the poultry industry to the Holocaust, and that was seen as being very insensitive.
I think that that's not wrong to be seen as insensitive. Like it was that PETA exists though on kind of a platform of shock, That's kind of how they have advertised themselves in the past, and I'm not surprised that they went there.
Yeah. For sure, yeah, and they received a lot of criticism for that, and I think they eventually did pull the messaging on that back. Animal activists have made similar associations between animal farming and slavery, so that also is a deeply problematic characterization. So it's not just anti-indigenous issues; it's also like the messaging that animal rights activists have used have often.
Chickens are the same as black slaves. Like, maybe not.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Like that, that's a deeply uncomfortable thing to say. And it's really no wonder that there's so much distrust between sort of certain animal rights activists and racialized communities, right? So we also have to talk about the connection between veganism and white nationalism, because apparently Nazis ruin everything.
Honestly, I'm surprised it's taken us this long to have a Nazi conversation. What is this, episode 8, 9?
Yeah, and I want to say this should really go without saying, but the vast majority of vegans are not white nationalists.
Most vegans are not Nazis.
I would hope it was 0, but it's not, so we got to talk about it. So there is evidently a sizable portion of white nationalists that are vegan. And there's a Vice article that goes into this a little bit more if you're interested. I don't know a lot about Nazi ideology. I don't really want to learn because I think we should just shut that shit down. But apparently there is something to do with the concept of blood and soil that like makes veganism something that some white nationalists like. And Hitler was famously vegetarian. We talked in the last episode about the like weird association between vegetarianism and eugenics, because there's a certain element of the sort of previous vegetarian movement that was about sort of depriving yourself of pleasures, and it was about sort of achieving a perfection. And even though I would say that vegetarianism and veganism, conceived correctly, is actually about the respect for life, and that should transfer to all human life. There are sort of variants of the vegan and vegetarian movements that historically and in the present are deeply racist, and that's something that people just need to acknowledge, because if we don't recognize that it's true, it's not possible to actually like combat racism within the movement and to be anti-oppressive.
And like weed it out.
Yeah.
So do you know, was Hitler's reasoning for vegetarianism Like, I knew he was a vegetarian, but I try not to think about Hitler too often.
Yeah.
I'm on the internet often enough that, like, people are always talking about it anyways. But was he trying to deprive himself of pleasure? Like, was that his reasoning? Or did he... I can't remember why he was a vegetarian. Do you remember why?
Yeah, I don't know why either, but, like, I imagine it was this, like, in the same vein as, like, why Kellogg was a vegetarian, right? Like, the whole deprive yourselves of pleasure, be abstinent, like, that sort of set of ideas was very popular at the time, and it was also often linked to eugenics, which obviously is something Hitler liked. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was the justification. But I don't know. There's enough shitty stuff in the world that I don't really think we need to spend time on Hitler in this podcast. There are plenty of people that have done that already. But yeah, just to say that there is a component of the vegan movement. It's a small one, but there is a component that is comprised of white nationalists, and that's something that it's important to recognize. A couple more things I want to say about veganism and racism. So until recently, there's been a lack of representation for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in animal rights organizations, and that's something that is starting to change. Animal rights activists now are starting to be really attuned to this problem. And they're starting to recognize the need to be more intersectional, both in their organizations and in how the movement's represented. So that means essentially taking seriously oppression and thinking about developing strategies that are more inclusive. So that is something that vegan activists today are really preoccupied with, and that's great. I think.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So I found a really good article just to make this a little bit more positive than it has been. I found an article by Gloria Oladipo, and she wrote an article for Afropunk that essentially explains how vegans can be more woke, which I think I thought it was really helpful. And so she essentially has 4 solutions. So the first one is don't culturally appropriate. So vegan versions of cultural dishes should come from members of that culture. So, like, if you're a white vegan, maybe don't be making, like, Caribbean vegan food, let the Caribbean community do that, which I think just makes sense.
In a commercial sense. If you just want to make Caribbean food at home, then
yes,
no shame.
But don't, appropriation is about exploiting and making money, right? So yeah, don't be making money off of, like, veganizing cultural dishes that aren't your own culture. The second one is that you should support initiatives that make plants more accessible. So she makes a really good point that food deserts are often in racialized communities. I know for sure that's true in Toronto, and I would imagine it's true in, like, many other major cities. Solving that problem can be a first focus for animal rights organizations, because if it's easier for all communities to access affordable plant-based food, more people are going to consider a plant-based diet.
Yeah, you know why I ate cheeseburgers 6 times in December? Because they're $1 at McDonald's.
Yeah, exactly. So supporting community garden initiatives, even though that might not seem to be directly linked to animal welfare, it actually does have an effect on decreasing consumption of meat. So maybe that's a way to do that. That's a more effective way to approach a problem of animal consumption than throwing blood on people and, like, or throwing paint that's supposed to look like blood on people and shaming them for their lifestyle choices,
Yeah.
Her third point is that more Black, Indigenous, and people of color need to be represented in the vegan movement. So this is like a book that I was reading recently featured polling that shows that actually, despite the stereotypes, there is no difference racially in terms of the profile of vegetarians. So American vegetarians are equally likely to be Black or like Latino, Latina, as they are to be white or any other racial background. So this stereotype of vegetarians being so white actually isn't true, but it's sort of foundational to how animal rights activists have represented themselves for a long time. So the argument that's being made in this article is that you need to start visually representing BIPOC people and communities in the veganism movement, so people see themselves in that movement. And you also need to meaningfully include them in leadership roles. And the last thing is just show up for the causes of racialized groups. So just acknowledge that like some of these communities go through a lot and you need to actually be a good ally. So show up at protests for their causes, even if they're not about, your particular cause of choice. Helping to be anti-oppression helps everybody.
Or at the very least, don't like dox them when they make a restaurant that it doesn't appeal to you, Like look at things a little bit more closely before you go and shit on them.
Yes, exactly. And just recognizing that not everybody can approach, this is applicable to all lifestyle issues that we talk about on this podcast. Not everybody approaches it from the same position. And so issues of race and class and various other things are very relevant to how people live their lives. And they mean that for some people, it's a lot easier to adopt certain values into their practices. And for other people, it's a lot harder, right?
And you can acknowledge that without being a dick about it.
Yeah, but don't just acknowledge it, right? Like that's step one. Step two is to actually help to overcome those systems of oppression. And if you're only doing the first one, you're not actually being a very good ally.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's a very good point. Thank you for correcting me.
You gotta show up too. Yeah, anyway. So I want to be a little bit positive. And the good news is that veganism is becoming a friendlier and more inclusive animal-free movement. That they're really, the activists today are, not all of them, but most of them are starting to see the errors of that sort of past behavior and are starting to sort of change their approach.
Yay!
Yeah. And that new inclusivity focus has really already benefited the movement immensely. So it's underscored a need to focus on institutional change rather than individual lifestyle choices. So the animal rights movement a decade ago really would have focused on telling everybody to go vegan. But now there's much more of an emphasis on telling people how fucked animal farming is and that laws need to protect animals better, which is something that people intuitively support. So there's a book that I read for this podcast called The End of Animal Farming. And this is sort of one of the main points that the author J.C. Reese makes. So he essentially says shaming individuals for eating meat really undermined the movement, and shaming factory farms is way more effective in addition to being more inclusive.
Yeah, because I don't know about you, but when somebody comes to me and they say, hey, you've been living your life wrong for the last 29, however old I am, years.
Yeah.
I don't want to change when somebody attacks me. I want to double down. You know what I mean? Like, what are you talking about? I wouldn't have been being evil for 30 years. Don't judge me. You don't know me. Whereas if someone comes in and says, hey, isn't this thing that we're all a part of really shitty? Let's change it together. Then I'm more likely to be like, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And there is his book goes into this in more detail. I'd really recommend reading it, even if you don't care about veganism that much. But he talks about how that there are psychological elements that make it more difficult to get people to change when you're telling them to change. And that if you focus on those collective goals, you actually bring people on side a lot more easily. And that in turn may make people change their behavior. So that's really helpful from a strategic perspective, partially because there's already significant evidence to show that people aren't comfortable with factory farming. And that's something we said in the vegetarianism episode, but I actually found evidence of it for this podcast. So I just want to say it quickly. So there was a 2015 Gallup poll that asked basically whether people thought that animals deserve the same rights, some rights, or no rights. And they found that 32% of Americans believe that animals deserve the same rights as humans, which is a pretty,
whoa,
I would not have expected.
That's significant. Yeah.
And then another 62% said that they deserve some rights. So that's a lot,
That's basically everybody.
Yeah.
Between the same and some, it's everybody. Everybody thinks that animals deserve at least some rights.
Yes. Yeah, so you're working from a population that's likely to be sympathetic. And so when you're looking at it from that lens, it actually is super surprising that the animal rights movement hasn't had more success than it has. And the argument of J.C. Reese is basically, it's because we've been shaming people for all this time, and instead, you got to focus on institutional change. I just also want to note California's Proposition 2, which is basically a ballot initiative to ban animal confinement in small spaces. It drew the highest positive turnout for any citizen initiative in the state's history. So people are on board with this stuff. That is all the stuff on vegan activism. Do you want to talk about veganism as a dietary choice now?
Okay, sure.
So as we mentioned before, vegans don't eat animals or animal-derived products. And that obviously includes meat, fish, poultry, dairy, and eggs. But one of the most difficult things about going vegan is navigating all of the secret animal products that are in our food. If you're interested in like trying veganism or just eating less meat, and or even if you just want to know when you're eating meat, because sometimes like you might be okay with eating meat on occasion, but you don't necessarily want it in your snack foods. Could be a reasonable position, even if you're not vegan or vegetarian.
Or if you're eating it, at least know that you're eating it. Like, I want to be in charge of the choices I make. Like, oh, if I reach for something that has animal product in it, I want to be doing it on purpose.
Yes, absolutely. And so there are a couple of places out there that have good tools for you. So PETA has a comprehensive list of animal-derived ingredients. It can be pretty overwhelming to go through that list because I don't know. I found it really tough to memorize it because it's so long, and then you're reading through the ingredient list, and you're like, I don't remember what these words that I didn't know before today. I don't remember which one of those were on the list. So, does this complicated chemical ingredient like include meat or not? But it is out there. There's also not your favorite website, but a website you've cited before, dummies.com.
Yes.
Yeah, dummies.com actually had a really good list. It wasn't like as comprehensive as PETA's, which isn't that surprising, but it had a really easy to use layout, so I would recommend them. And then maybe we'll just go through some of the stuff that has animal ingredients that you might see a lot.
Like the really common things that might surprise people?
Yeah. So two common ones that won't surprise people are beeswax and honey. But yeah, casein. Did you come across casein at all?
No, what is that?
So it's a milk protein that's derived from animal's milk, and it can also sometimes show up in ingredients list as calcium caseinate or sodium caseinate. So
what foods has that in it? What is that?
I can't remember where I saw that, and I don't have it written down, but
that's
processed foods.
Okay, fair enough. The freezer section.
Yeah. Then there's confectioner's glaze, which is also sometimes called resinous glaze, shellac, natural glaze, or pure food glaze. So that comes from a hardened resinous material that's secreted by an insect called the lac insect. So that you will often see in candy. You will sometimes see it in fruit.
What? How? Why?
Yeah, not all fruit is vegan.
Is it? Wait, hang on. Is it because the insect lives inside the fruit and secretes inside of it?
No, it's because there's fucking wax sometimes on fruit.
And the wax is why?
Yeah,
okay.
So fruits and vegetables, weirdly not always vegan. There was this whole thing, there's a British coffee chain called Costa, and there's a group of people on the internet just freaking out because they found out that the bananas that Costa sells aren't vegan.
What? Bananas? They have a cup. They come with a case. Why would you need to put anything on a banana?
Okay, so the wax, I dug into this a little bit because it is kind of interesting. There's also there's a screen cap of, I can't remember what company this was, but there was a picture of like a soda drink, and it had a slice of lemon in it. And it was not vegan because of the lemon, not because of the pop. Yeah, so some fruits, and I had heard vegetables, but I'm not actually sure which vegetables. They're sometimes coated with either beeswax or shellac, and that makes the fruit look prettier, and it can also reduce moisture loss and delay rotting, so it makes things last longer. So sometimes if you're going to the store and you're buying an apple, that may not be vegan, unfortunately.
I would just like to say, for the record, right now, my feelings on insects is that I am happy to eat them. I do not feel super bad. Maybe that will change as we do this podcast, but I will have cricket chips, give me some cricket flour, beeswax, honey, this weird insect that secretes onto my apples. I just don't feel as bad about insects. I won't buy, silk anymore, if I'm buying silk, I've killed a whole bunch of silkworms so that I can like wear something nice, but I can wear nice things without like buying silk, basically. So, but when it comes to food, I'm like, okay, well, I need to eat. I don't need to wear silk. I don't need to eat insects, sure. But also, I feel a lot less bad about eating a cricket than I do about eating a cow.
Why, though?
I don't know. I guess I just don't care about bugs. I first of all, I'm not the kind of person that scoops up a spider and puts it outside. I'm the kind of person that throws a book at it from across the room and just crushes it to death. And I've always been that way, and maybe that will change, but I just, don't value insects the same way that I value cows. Maybe, they'll do some research and they'll be like, actually, insects are as intelligent as human beings and mourn their dead. And I'll be like, but I'm still going to eat them, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, I don't want to judge you too much on this show.
Oh no, here it comes.
but like, I mean, we talked about Peter Singer in the last episode, right? And he would, I think, call that speciesist, right? And he would say that what we should care about isn't like our inherent empathy coding that like, I mean, that's why people are upset when they find out that someone's eating a dog, but they're not so upset about cows, right? Like, you're just extending that same logic to ants, right? That, I don't know. There are different ethical justifications for sure, and maybe some insects aren't as complicated, and so we shouldn't give them as much consideration. But from my point of view, if we know that insects feel pain, which they probably do, it's still ethically tricky to eat them, you know? That's just my view. You can come to different points of view, but anyway, I don't know.
I also feel like insects, it's harder to give them like as bad of a quality of life as we do to cows. Like, you can give them more space. They're insects.
Yeah, but like, I don't know. Like, conversely, if you're eating a steak, you're eating part of one cow, right? If you're eating like a burger made from crickets, you're probably consuming like 5 or 6 sentient beings at least, right?
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know. The point is it's complicated, right? I don't know.
Well, when we do our episode on bees eventually, which we're never going to do. We're just going to tease every time.
Bees.
Maybe I'll change my mind on that. I feel like I'm pretty flexible on my views.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, this is all like, I mean, I can in principle think that, and probably at the end of Veganuary, I'll still occasionally eat cheese, and I'll consider myself a hypocrite for that. But the good news is I'm in good company with the rest of the world that also thinks factory farming is fucked and still eats animal products sometimes.
Yeah.
The good news, though, with fruit is that there are alternatives to animal-based waxes that are available, and some retailers will use those. The bad news is that they're both problematic also. So one of the non-animal alternative waxes is it's a synthetic polyethylene wax, which is a petroleum byproduct. So in that case, it's linked to the oil industry, so maybe not so great for climate change. And the other option is carnauba wax, which is a palm derivative. And I think in a couple of episodes from now, we're going to talk about palm oil. So just a spoiler, it's fucked.
Terrible.
It's not great, and it's in everything. But yeah, so your fruit may not be vegan because sometimes it's coated in an animal-based wax.
So the most ethical thing you can do is go to an orchard and pick your own fruit. So everyone just go out and do that. No problem. Easy peasy.
But what if you have to drive to the orchard and you're using a lot of carbon emissions?
Oh my God, you're right. Everybody needs to walk to their closest orchard, pick enough fruit to last yourselves the year, make jam out of it. I don't know. Although if you're making jam, it uses sugar. And in a few episodes, we're going to talk about the sugar industry.
The most ethical thing you can do is curl up in the fetal position and not consume anything. No, we're going to try to give you some more practical suggestions than that. But a few more animal derivatives that you might recognize in common foods. So gelatin is a gelling agent that's derived from animal collagen. So that is often in candy. It's in most candies. This was like one of the things that was hardest for me when I became vegetarian, was realizing that like I couldn't eat some of my favorite candies because they had gelatin in them. But there's a fair amount of non-animal based candies out there that you can consume. So then there's L-cysteine, a dough conditioner in some prepackaged breads and baked goods. So Even though bread usually doesn't need to contain dairy products, oftentimes if you're looking at grocery store bread, it'll have this in it. So you can't eat that if you're vegan. Then there's whey, which is in way too much stuff. Ooh. Yeah, so, I mean, if you'll remember from the nursery rhyme, whey it's basically the liquid that remains once milk is curdled or it's been churned and strained. I found it a lot in chips. That was where I saw it. I don't know why, but I guess it must add some kind of flavoring that companies like. Did you see like any of these ingredients and things?
Perhaps I did, and I just didn't realize that they weren't vegetarian. But I don't think I've seen whey on anything I've been trying to buy. Lately I've been trying to just buy fresh fruits and vegetables. Apparently those aren't vegan anyways. But
I like it. You just went to one ingredient things and are just making your own stuff.
I try, yeah.
To be vegan.
Literally, yeah. Like a couple of times I was like, I'm really craving chips, so I did look at things. But if I am looking at an ingredients list and I don't recognize an ingredient, usually I'll Google it, or I'll just put the item back on the shelf. I'm like, well, if you're not going to tell me what this is, then I don't want to eat it. So,
yeah, definitely. So then there's also lactose that I also found in like a lot of packaged foods. It can also show up on ingredients list as saccharum lactin or D-lactose. So it's essentially a milk sugar.
Yeah, that one I did know. I do recognize lactose on stuff as like, well, better not buy these. Although usually if I'm looking at something, I'm like, I know this is going to have milk products in it because it's cheese. It's cheesy chips. That's what I'm looking at. Oh, are these cheddar chips vegan?
Yes.
No, probably not.
But even like ketchup chips or salt and vinegar, like most mainstream brands will have milk in their flavoring. The other one, vitamin D3 or omega-3 fatty acids, they can be made without animal products, but oftentimes if you see those on an ingredients list, they'll be from animal-based sources. If you don't specifically see that they're not, assume that they are is the general rule. And then additives beginning with E. So if you see something like E904,
oh, interesting.
that's going to be usually animal derived. A lot of the E additives apparently are. So those are some ones to look for if you're trying not to consume animal products in like processed or packaged foods. You want to talk about meat substitutes now?
Okay.
So I'm curious, if you were to guess, when do you think the first reference to a plant-based food that mimics animal flesh is from?
When?
Yeah.
2007.
2007. So it's actually 965 AD.
Oh, okay. Well, I was wrong. I'll see myself out.
I would not have guessed it either. Yes. Drastically earlier than I would have thought. And it was a magistrate in a city in China that encouraged tofu consumption as a more frugal alternative to animal flesh. And he referred to tofu as mock lamb chops, which I think is kind of interesting.
I love that.
Tofu tastes nothing like lamb chops.
No, it does not at all. But what a great way to convince people to at least try it.
Yeah. So that is like the first reference in history, but it's like kind of a cheat because it like not tofu. It's its own thing with its own taste. It's not like specifically developed to mimic the taste of meat, at least on its own. So the first reference to vegetarian meat wasn't until 1852. And it just sounds revolting. It was a reference to a sausage-like mixture made by squeezing chopped turnips and beets.
Those are things I don't even eat by themselves.
I know. So, like, it's no wonder that vegetarian burgers for a really long time had a reputation for being awful. Like, God. Today you can get really good ones, but if someone tried to feed me chopped turnips and beets and told me it was a sausage, I also would not have been on board. Yeah, so the first recorded veggie burger was made in 1939, and then sort of the most famous meat alternative, tofurkey, probably most people have heard of it, it was introduced in 1995. So this is pretty recent, actually.
Not as recent as 2007, so I'm just going to lie down over here.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I think it's, the point is that, like, meat-based alternatives, today we're seeing such an exciting explosion of new products that actually, like, people have sat down and thought about it and tried to make it taste as much like meat as possible, not to get vegans on side, not to get vegetarians on side, but to try to get the sort of like aspirationally more plant-based people, you know, people that do eat meat, that want their cheeseburgers.
It's a bigger market.
Yeah. Like the products are just improving as a result of that, because you've got a potentially much larger market. So Beyond Meat and the Impossible Burger are sort of like the two behemoths that we talk about today. And they were both released around the same time, which is only a couple years ago. So it's, you know, when you say 2007, like, that's not actually such a bad guess, because those companies weren't even around back then, right? Like, yes, there was Tofurkey, but how many people were eating it, honestly? And yeah, I also have a fun fact about Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger. I don't know if anyone else will find this fun, but they're both founded by people whose last name is Brown.
Oh, that just makes things confusing.
Yeah, basically the same product. There are like slight differences. And one's founded by Ethan Brown and the other's founded by Patrick Brown.
No relation.
No, I don't think so, yeah. So there was a difference in the strategy that both of them employed. So I've never eaten an Impossible Burger, and I'm not sure exactly what they taste like, but Impossible Burger, they focused on the high-end market, so they started to release the burger in trendy restaurants. That was sort of their approach. And Beyond Meat was like, fuck it, we're going straight to the grocery store. And then, of course, A&W. So the plant-based food industry is now big enough that it has its own industry association, which I think is pretty cool. And there are a lot of plant-based startups that are out there, and a lot of big companies that are starting to create their own plant-based foods. So Unilever, they were kind of assholes because they sued one of the first egg-free mayonnaise companies, and they got a huge amount of backlash for it. And now they have their own egg-free mayonnaise. So they've joined the party, I guess. General Mills in 2016 invested in a nut, cheese, and yogurt company called Kite Hill. And Tyson Foods, the chicken company, has also invested in Beyond Meat. So a lot of big food companies are recognizing that plant-based is the way the market's going, which is, I think, pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like lab-grown meat. So there are a bunch of different names for this. Cultured meat, cell-cultured meat, cell-based meat, in vitro meat, and clean meat are other terms that you might hear. And they're also really new. And the idea with cultured meat is basically that you actually get a product that not only just mimics the properties of meat, which is what the plant-based burgers do, but they actually are meat. They're just not from animals. They're through like cell cultures, basically. And the earliest case that I was able to find of cultured meat was from 1998, when a NASA-funded group of engineers grew goldfish meat in vitro, but they weren't actually able to eat it because it wasn't FDA approved. So they made these like lab-grown goldfish that they made into fish sticks, but they couldn't eat it. So apparently they smelled exactly the same. And then the first time that cultured meat was actually eaten, at least that we know of, was in 2003. And it was an art exhibition of cultured frog meat that was created by an Australian artist. And it was like this big art exhibition in France that I'm sure was meant to have some point. I don't know.
I don't know. Sometimes I feel like art exists for art's sake.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's kind of interesting too. Like the animal rights movement has had some debate on like which plant-based alternative should you be focusing on first? And there's some idea that like if you're focusing on reducing harm, you want to reduce consumption of chicken meat, eggs, and fish meat because there's a lot of harm associated with those products and a lot of animals die for that. So like if you're focusing on just what's going to reduce the harm, having plant-based alternatives for chicken, eggs, and fish is like where you should start. But on the other hand, there's like a need to focus on what's the easiest thing to make a plant-based alternative to, especially like in the early stages. So the focus instead has been on dairy and eggs because that's just easier from a technological perspective. So that's all the research I had. Do you want to talk about our challenges?
Yeah, I think I'll go first this time because I don't have very much to say on this one. I think I covered most of it at the beginning. We're 2 weeks into it now. We're recording this episode on January 13th. Shout out to my birthday. I have failed a couple of times, I will be honest. Not just because, obviously, I didn't buy the Campbell's soup, but it's exactly as hard as I thought it would be, basically. I knew going in, especially after we did a vegetarian challenge, that I would struggle. On the very first day, I was on a tour that I think I mentioned to you, where basically I, as a tour guide, take busloads of tourists into different locations in Canada, and I was in the Rocky Mountains for New Year's with a bus, and I was like really looking forward to this trip. It's like, it's going to be amazing. And then on January 1st, when we were supposed to come back to Vancouver, they closed Canada has one road, and they closed it for avalanche blasting, and we were stuck in the middle of nowhere, BC for a very long time. And then when we started to go finally at the end, by the time we left the town that we were stuck in, it was basically the time where we were supposed to be getting into Vancouver. So we were stuck for a long time. And I was like, right, we do not have time to stop and get people dinner, especially since there isn't anywhere in the middle of BC on January 1st that's going to be open anyways. So I told the whole bus that I would order them pizza. We ended up getting stuck in traffic because there was a car accident after the avalanche blasting. For 3 hours, we were just sitting still outside of the middle of nowhere again. So by the time we got to the pizza place, it was 11 o'clock at night. First of all, I tried to order a vegan pizza in Domino's in the middle of nowhere, BC. It was nah, dog. So I did try. And then I could have there was a Tim Hortons open for 10 more minutes up the street. But my position as the tour guide was to stay with the bus. So I broke down and I had some pizza. That was on day 1 that I failed right away. And it made me very sad. But also the pizza tasted so good. I had such a bad day.
Yeah, and extenuating circumstances, I think.
Feel that's why I had to explain myself. The other times that I failed was that I accidentally ate a piece of chocolate that was sitting in the break room at my other job. And it was in my mouth, and I was like, oh, shit! And then, yeah, the other 2 times I failed was when people gave me free chocolate. So... that was on me. But otherwise, I feel like I'm doing really well. What about you?
Yeah, so I failed one time. And I think it just comes down to planning. So I had not gotten up early enough in the morning to eat breakfast before I was in the airport for my flight. And I looked and looked and looked for vegan food in the Edmonton airport, and I just could not find it. The only thing that I thought might work is getting a smoothie from Booster Juice that just didn't have dairy, but I did not think that would fill me up for the entire day. So I broke and got pizza also. I figured if I'm gonna fail, I might as well fail big, right? So yeah, that was my one. Otherwise, I've been doing pretty well. It was a lot harder for the first 6 days of the month, I was with my parents still celebrating the holidays in suburban Alberta. And that was difficult because none of their items that they have, just as snack foods or whatever, very few of them were vegan. So it was this weird position where at first I had bought some groceries, but then it's close enough to me leaving that I'm not going to buy a bunch of stuff to just have sit in their house. So by the end, by January 5th, I was literally having meals of Triscuits and peanut butter. It was so sad. But since I've gotten back, it's been a lot easier. And I really have to shout out, a couple of my friends just hosted a Ukrainian Christmas dinner yesterday. It's a little late, but when they invited me, I was like, so I'm doing Veganuary and I do not expect you to cater to my needs, because they've already for years been doing it as a vegetarian. Well, they have they cook salmon, but they make sure that there are vegetarian options for the people that go, because a number of my friends are vegetarian. But neither of them are. And it's like, you already go so far to accommodate that I'm not going to make you make everything vegan. So like the first dish that you have in Ukrainian Christmas dinner is like this, it's basically like wheat oatmeal. It's really tasty. It's my favorite part of the dinner, but it's like, it's just like sweet wheat. And so I'm like, that is vegan. So I'll eat that. And then I'll eat the borscht, which you already make vegan anyway. And then don't worry about it anyway. But they made me special vegan pierogies, and I was so excited.
That's really sweet. They can be your really shout out of the week.
Yeah. And so I thought that was really nice. Otherwise, I've been just kind of enjoying going to vegan restaurants in Toronto because there's actually like a lot on offer, and there are places that I had been meaning to get to but hadn't. So I've actually been eating really well.
Nice. Yeah. I don't go to restaurants very often anyways because I am too frugal. But I have gone to a couple of restaurants with some friends in the last couple of weeks. And there was one of them, they were like, oh, let's go out for dinner. And I was like, sure. So I'm doing Veganuary. I do not expect you to cater to me. Yeah, you have to have that
conversation,
yes.
Yeah.
I was like, you do not have to cater to me. But then we ended up going to an all-vegan restaurant anyways called Meat in Vancouver. Maybe listeners know it, but there's a Meat in Gastown, there's a Meat in Yaletown, and there's a Meat on Main, and it's just this fully vegan restaurant. And honestly, it might be the best poutine I've ever had in my life.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm going to go there. I'm going there tonight for my birthday dinner.
Oh, that's nice.
So is that it for us then? Is that our vegan episode?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, amazing. There's so much good information.
I do want to give one more shout out. I know I already did one, but I also
you didn't really. You didn't say their names. Who is it? Tell us.
So Ian and Zoe, they were wonderful in accommodating me at Ukrainian Christmas. I also want to shout out Robert because Robert is vegan and gave me a lot of tips on stuff to read for this podcast, which was immensely helpful in prepping for it. So thank you, Robert.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. I really like doing these shout outs. They make me feel very happy with our friends and the people who support us. Do we have like a call to action this week? Is there anything people can do other than Veganuary, which is obviously done by the time this episode rolls out?
So for the vegetarianism episode, we suggested that people try to reduce their meat consumption. So maybe for this one, try a vegan restaurant.
Yeah. If you're in Vancouver, try Meat. I love it. I've been there 3 times in the last month, and I don't even eat at restaurants ever.
Yeah, and if you're in Toronto, Planta is incredible. I didn't even know this was possible, but I had incredible vegan sushi at Planta Queen. So good. And if you're in Edmonton, because I know a lot of our listeners are Albertan, the Buckingham has the best vegan chicken wings I've ever had. I get them every time I'm in Edmonton, and I could eat them every day.
So that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to get us on Twitter, we are at Pullback Podcast. If you want to send us an email, we're at pullbackpod@gmail.com. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. Send us a nice message. It sustains us. Leave us a review. We love it. It's my birthday, so leave me a birthday review on iTunes. That would be incredible. 5 stars because it's my birthday. Thanks for listening, guys. We'll catch you next time.
Oh, yeah. Happy birthday. I totally forgot. That is such an asshole. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna drop that on you like halfway through.